Hello, everybody, and nice to be with you. I'm Michael Millerman. This is Millerman Talks. Have a couple of articles queued up for us here today, starting with Vanity Fair, Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. They're not MAGA, they're not QAnon. Curtis Yarvin and the rising right are crafting a different strain of conservative politics. This is by James Pogue, and it was released today, April 20th. Just going to wait a little bit, though, before jumping into it. Since this is a live stream, it'll be nice to have some people join us. So we'll have this, Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. We'll also be looking at this article from April 3rd, The Enemies of Liberalism Are Showing Us What It Really Means. As well as Kremlin insiders alarmed over growing toll of Putin's war in Ukraine. That's news from today. And maybe if we have time to get to it, this was the first long-form review of my book. I haven't read it yet. I mean, I've read the book, but I haven't read the review. Matt McManus, Michael Millerman's beginning with Heidegger. We'll see whether we get to that. But what I really want to start with is this. Vanity Fair, Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. Let's have at it. It was Halloween in Orlando, and we had piled into a car to make a short trip from the Hilton to an after party down the road to wind up the first night of the latest edition of a gathering called the National Conservatism Conference. For at least many of the young people, the actual business of conference going seemed to be beside the point, a gesture at how we used to conduct politics before life in America spun out of control. There were jokes, or maybe they were serious questions about whether one of the guys tagging along with us was a Fed. I surreptitiously made a few searches of the name he'd given me and was surprised when I couldn't find a single plausible hit, though that could have been because he was a hyper-secret crypto type. There were some of those floating around. Not that anyone cared, these were people who were used to guarding their words. "Don't F me here," a dark-haired woman named Amanda Milius said to me, as she somewhat imperiously dealt with a guy at the door who was skeptical about letting a reporter into the party, and say we're all in here sacrificing kids to Moloch. We're just the last normal people hanging out at the end of the world. I had met Milius outside the Hilton when I asked for a cigarette, and she began to chaperone me around, telling people who eyed my press pass that I was there to profile her as an up-and-coming female director who she said had attracted more Amazon streams than any woman ever with her first documentary, a counter-narrative about Russiagate. Annie Leibovitz is still scheduling the photo shoot, she kept saying. In this world, almost every word is layered in so much irony that you can never be sure what to take seriously or not. Perhaps a semi-conscious defense mechanism for people that are convinced that everyone's out to get them. Let me get all those ads off the screen. I'm using, what do you call it? That version of the browser where, okay, hold on. Let me zoom right in there. Okay, that's better, isn't it? Yeah, so again, this is a Vanity Fair article, Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. Thought we'd have a look. In this world, almost every word is so layered in so much irony that you can never be sure what to take seriously or not, perhaps a semi-conscious defense mechanism for people convinced everyone is out to get them. "Oh, F," she said as we walked into a small ballroom where the party was already underway. The room was pitifully quiet, lit in strip club red, and the sparse crowd was almost entirely male, with a cash bar off in the corner that seemed unable to produce drinks fast enough to buoy the mood. "We have a thing we say," she said. "This is what the people at the Washington Post think we're doing." Well, this is exactly what the people at the Washington Post think we're doing. Okay, so far they're discussing Amanda Milius at the National Conservatism Conference. Again, we're getting into Peter Thiel and the New Right in this article. A portly guy running for Congress in Georgia made his way to the front of the room to give a speech heavy on MAGA buzzwords and florid expressions of fealty to Donald Trump. "This is sad," Milius said. No one cheered or even seemed interested, but this was not Trump world, even if many of the people in the room saw Trump as a useful tool. And these parties aren't always so lame. NatCon, as this conference is known, you guys may know, National Conservatism Conference, I think was founded by Yoram Hazony, author of The Virtue of Nationalism and other books on conservatism, on Zionism, and on political theory. NatCon, as this conference is known, has grown into a big tent gathering for a whole range of people who want to push the American right in a more economically populist, culturally conservative, assertively nationalist direction. It draws everyone from Israel hawks to fusty paleocon professors to mainstream figures like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. But most of the media attention that the conference attracts focuses on a cohort of rosy, young, blazer-wearing activists and writers, a crop of people representing the American right's radical young intellectuals, as a headline in The New Republic would soon put it, or conservatism's terrifying future, as David Brooks called them in The Atlantic. But the people these pieces describe, who made up most of the partygoers around me, were only the most buttoned-up seam of a much larger and stranger political ferment, burbling up mainly within America's young and well-educated elite, part of an intra-media class infowar. The podcasters, bro-ish anonymous Twitter posters, online philosophers, artists, and amorphous scenesters in this world are variously known as dissidents, neo-reactionaries, post-leftists, or the heterodox fringe, though they're all often grouped for convenience under the heading of America's New Right. They have a wildly diverse set of political backgrounds, with influences ranging from 17th century Jacobite royalists to Marxist cultural critics, to so-called reactionary feminists, to the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, whom they sometimes refer to with semi-ironic affection as Uncle Ted. Which is to say that this new right is not a part of the conservative movement as most people in America would understand it. It's better described as a tangled set of frameworks for critiquing the systems of power and propaganda that most people reading this probably think of as the way the world is. And one point shapes all of it. It is a project to overthrow the thrust of progress, at least such as liberals understand the word. This worldview, these worldviews, run counter to the American narrative of the last century that economic growth and technological innovation are inevitably leading us toward a better future. It's a position that has become quite edgy and cool in new tech outposts like Miami and Austin, and in downtown Manhattan, where new rightish politics are in, and signifiers like a demure cross necklace have become markers of a transgressive chic. No one is leading this movement, but it does have key figures. Okay, hello to everybody who's here. We're reading today's article in Vanity Fair, out Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. So no one is leading this movement, but it does have key figures. One is Peter Thiel, the billionaire who helped fund NatCon, and who had just given the conference's opening address. Thiel had also funded things like the edgelordy and post-left infected New People's Cinema Film Festival, which ended its week-long run of parties and screenings in Manhattan just a few days before NatCon began. He's long been a donor to Republican political candidates, but in recent years, Thiel has grown increasingly involved in the politics of this younger and weirder world, becoming something like a nefarious godfather or genial rich uncle, depending on your perspective. Podcasters and art world figures now joke about their hope to get so-called Thiel bucks. Speaking of which, MillermanSchool.com. His most significant recent outlays have been to two young Senate candidates who are deeply enmeshed in this scene and influenced by its intellectual currents. Hillbilly elegy author J.D. Vance, running for the Republican nomination in Ohio, and Blake Masters in Arizona. Thiel has given more than $10 million to super PACs supporting the men's candidacies, and both are personally close to him. Vance is a former employee of Thiel's Mithril Capital, and Masters, until recently the COO of Thiel's so-called family office, also ran the Thiel Foundation, which has become increasingly intertwined with this new right ecosystem. These three, Thiel, Vance, Masters, are all friends with Curtis Yarvin, a 48-year-old ex-programmer and blogger who's done more than anyone to articulate the world historical critique and popularize the key terms of the new right. You'll often hear people in this world, again under many layers of irony, call him things like Lord Yarvin or our prophet. I was looking around the party for Vance, who hadn't arrived yet, when Milius nudged me and pointed to a table off to our left. Why is it that whenever I see Curtis, he's surrounded by a big table of incels, she asked, with apparent fondness. I spotted Yarvin, a slight bespectacled man with long dark hair, drinking a glass of wine with a crowd that included Josh Hammer, the national conservatism-minded young opinion editor of Newsweek, and Michael Anton, a Machiavelli scholar and former spokesman for Trump's National Security Council, and a prominent public intellectualizer of the Trump movement. Just an aside, guys, off the article here, I'm going to say that I did an interview with Michael Anton. We spoke about Leo Strauss's thoughts on Machiavelli on the Stakes podcast. So if you know Michael Anton, Leo Strauss, and Machiavelli, you may want to look that up and listen to it. Michael Anton is indeed a Machiavelli scholar. Other luminaries afoot for the conference included Dignity author Chris Arnade, who seemed slightly unsure about the whole NatCon thing, and Sohrab Ahmari, the former opinion editor of the New York Post, now a co-founder and editor at the new magazine Compact, whose vision is, according to its mission statement, shaped by our desire for a strong social democratic state that defends community, local and national, familial and religious, against the libertine left and a libertarian right. It's a very of-the-moment project. Hello to everyone who's here. Just a reminder, we're reading Vanity Fair, Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. Political reporters, at least the ones who've bothered to write about Yarvin, have often dismissed him as a kook, with a readership made up mostly of lonely internet weirdos, fascists, or both. Again, just getting off the article for a minute, that's not entirely true of all the sources, because as you know, we recently read a nice piece in Tablet magazine about Yarvin that was favorable. But to ignore him is to underestimate how Yarvin's ideas, or at least his ideas in conversation, with his, have become foundational to a whole political and cultural scene that goes much deeper than anything you'd learn from the panels and speeches at an event like NatCon. Or how those ideas are going to shape the future of the American right, whether or not Vance and Masters win their Senate primaries. I introduced myself, the author writes, and soon Milius and I were outside smoking as Yarvin and I chatted about whether he'd be willing to talk to me on the record. People often struggle with what to make of Thiel's involvement in this ecosystem. Last year, the journalist Max Chafkin published a biography of Thiel titled The Contrarian, in which he described Yarvin as the house political philosopher for a network often called the Thielverse. The book focuses heavily on Thiel's political maneuverings, describing how he evolved from being a hyper-libertarian to someone who now makes common cause with nationalists and populists. And it explains how Thiel helped both Cruz and Josh Hawley on their paths to the Senate. The Contrarian ends with a dark picture of the billionaire trying to extend his political reach ever more overtly by funding and shepherding the campaigns of Masters and Vance. Masters and Vance are very different from Hawley and Cruz, Chafkin writes. The former two are extensions of Thiel. This is only partly true. It would be just as accurate to say that Thiel has been influenced by the intellectual currents and political critiques of the new right that he's now helping to support. Many of these people are friendly with Thiel or admire him, but are by no means beholden to him. And many of them hold views that would seem to make Thiel, a tech oligarch currently worth around $8 billion, who recently resigned from the Meta, earlier called Facebook, board of directors, their natural enemy. This new right is heavily populated by people with graduate degrees, so there's a lot of debate about who is in it and whether or not it even exists. At one end are the NatCons, post-liberals, and traditionalist figures like Benedict Option author Rod Dreher, who envision a conservatism reinvigorated by an embrace of loyalist values, religious identity, and an active role for the state in promoting everything from marriage to environmental conservatism. But there's also a highly online set of Substack writers, podcasters, and anonymous Twitter posters, our true intellectual elite, as one podcaster describes them. This group encompasses everyone from rich crypto bros and tech executives to back to the landers to disaffected members of the American intellectual class like Up in the Air author Walter Kern, whose fulminations against groupthink and techno-authoritarianism have made him an unlikely champion to the dissident right and heterodox fringe. But they share a basic worldview that individualist liberal ideology, increasingly bureaucratic governments, and big tech are all combining into a world that is at once tyrannical, chaotic, and devoid of the systems of value and morality that give human life richness and meaning. As Blake Masters recently put it, a dystopian hell world. Kern didn't want to put a label on this movement, describing it as a fractious family of dissenters when I called him at his home in Montana, the author writes. A somewhat new loose coalition of people whose major concern is that we not end up in a top-down controlled state. He told me he didn't consider himself right-wing and found some of the anti-democratic ideas he heard expressed in the sphere to be personally chilling, but he described it as a zone of experimentation and free expression of a kind that was now closed off in America's liberal mainstream. They seem to want a war, he said. The last thing I want is some kind of definitive ideological war, which leaves out the heterodox, complicated, and almost naively open spirit of American politics. And the ferment is starting to get noticed. I think that's a really good sign, one of the hosts of the dissident right podcast, The Fed Post, said recently, discussing how Tucker Carlson had just quoted a tweet from one of their guests. This is a kind of burgeoning sect of thought, he went on, and it's causing people who are in positions of larger influence and relative power to actually have to start looking into it. Vance sits somewhere in between these two tendencies. At 37, he's a venture capitalist who's young enough to be exposed to the dissident online currents, but he's also shaped by the most deeply traditionalist thinking of the American right. He's friends with Yarvin, whom he openly cites as a political influence, and with Dreher, who was there when Vance was baptized into the Catholic Church in 2019. I'd been writing about militias and right-wing stirrings in the rural West for years, but I didn't really understand how this alchemy worked, the author writes, until I first met him last July. I'd gone back to Ohio to see my uncle, who was dying of cancer. Vance and I both grew up around Cincinnati, immersed in a culture of white rural migrants who had come from coal fields and farm towns to look for work in cities of the Midwest. We had met as a kind of experiment. I was going to be in town anyway, and because my uncle was sick, I was thinking a lot about the place and what it meant to me. On a whim, I asked, the author writes, an editor at a conservative magazine if I could write something from the perspective of a skeptical leftist. Vance suggested that we meet at a diner where my dad had often taken me as a kid. He was barely registering in the polls at the time. Vance believes that a well-educated and culturally liberal American elite has greatly benefited from globalization, the financialization of our economy, and the growing power of big tech. This has led an Ivy League intellectual and management class, a quasi-aristocracy he calls the regime, to adopt a set of economic and cultural interests that directly oppose those of the people in places like Middletown, Ohio, where he grew up. In the Vancian view, this class has no stake in what people on the new right often call the real economy, the farm and factory jobs that once sustained middle-class life in Middle America. This is a fundamental difference between new right figures like Vance and the Reaganite right-wingers of their parents' generation. To Vance, and he's said this, culture war is class warfare. Again, hi to everybody who's here. We're reading Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets, published in Vanity Fair today. Vance recently told an interviewer, I gotta be honest with you, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine. A flick at the fact that he thinks the American-led global order is as much about enriching defense contractors and think tank types as it is about defending America's interests. I do care about the fact that in my community right now, the leading cause of death among 18 to 45-year-olds is Mexican fentanyl. His criticisms of big tech as enemies of Western civilization often get lost in the run of Republican outrage over Trump being kicked off Twitter and Facebook, though they go much deeper than this. Vance believes that the regime has sold an elusive story that consumer gadgets and social media are constantly making our lives better, even as wages stagnate and technology feeds an epidemic of depression. I wrote a piece, the author says, that came across as critical of him. It expressed my deep hopelessness about the future of America. I figured he'd want nothing more to do with me, but the morning it was published, he sent me a short, heartfelt email. He said that he'd been a bit pained to read in the piece that my parents disliked him, but he said he'd like to talk more. I don't see you as a member of the elite because I see you as independent of their ideological strictures and incentives, he wrote, but maybe I'm just saying that because I like you. Despair, he signed off, serves the regime. Part of why people have trouble describing this new right is because it's a bunch of people who believe that the system that organizes our society and government, which most of us think of as normal, is actually bizarre and insane, which naturally makes them look bizarre and insane to people who think the system is normal. You'll hear these people talk about our globalized consumerist society as clown world. You'll often hear the worldview expressed by our media and our intellectual class described as the Matrix, or the Ministry of Truth, as Thiel described it in his opening keynote speech to NatCon. It can be confusing to turn on something like the influential underground podcast Good Ol' Boys and hear a figure like Michael Anton, talk to two autodidact Southern gamers about the makeup of the regime, if only because most people reading this probably don't think of America as the kind of place that has a regime at all. But that's because, as many people in the world would argue, we've been so effectively propagandized that we can't see how the system of power around us really works. This is not a conspiracy theory like QAnon, which presupposes that there are systems of power at work that normal people don't see. This is an idea that the people who work in our systems of power are so obtuse that they can't even see that they're part of a conspiracy. The fundamental premise of liberalism, Yarvin told me, is that there's this inexorable march toward progress. I disagree with that premise. He believes that this premise underpins a massive framework of power. My job, as he puts it, is to wake people up from the Truman Show. We spoke sharing a bench outside in the dark one evening, a few days into the conference. Yarvin is friendly and solicitous in person, despite the fact that he tends to think and talk so fast that he can start unspooling, reworking Baroque metaphors to explain ideas to listeners who have heard them many times before. Strange things can happen when you meet him. I'd gotten in touch with him through a mutual friend, the author writes, a journalist I knew from New York who once had a big magazine assignment to write about him. The piece never came out. They wanted him to say I was really evil and all that, Yarvin told me. He wouldn't do it and pulled the piece. And I thought, okay, that's a cool guy. This friend has now made a bunch of money in crypto, works on a project Yarvin helped launch to build a decentralized internet, and lives hours out into the desert in Utah where he'll occasionally call into new rightish podcasts. He recently had dinner with Thiel and Masters. Both Masters and Vance have raised money by offering donors a chance to dine with Thiel and the candidate. Yarvin has a pretty condescending view of the mainstream media. They're just predators, he has said, who have to make a living attacking people like him. They just need to eat. He doesn't usually deal with mainstream magazines and wrote that he'd been ambushed at the last NatCon in 2019 by a reporter for Harper's, where I, the journalist says, also write, who made him out to be a bit of a loon and predicted that the NatCon's populist program would soon be stripped of its parts by the corporate-minded Republican establishment. But the winds are shifting. He, meaning Yarvin, told me about how he'd gone to read poetry in New York recently at the Thiel-funded NPC Fest. A bunch of lit kids showed up, he said, grinning. I had grown into adulthood in the New York lit kid world. The author writes, even a few years ago, there was no question that anything like this could have happened. But now Yarvin is a cult hero to many in the ultra-hip crowd that you'll often hear referred to as the downtown scene. I don't even think Antifa bothered showing up, Yarvin said. What would they do? It was an art party. Yarvin has asked his new girlfriend, Lydia Lawrenson, a 37-year-old founder of a progressive magazine, to vet me. The radical right turn her life had taken created complications. One of my housemates was like, I don't know if I want Curtis in our house, she told me. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. I understand why you're saying that. Lawrenson had been a well-known blogger and activist in the BDSM scene back when Yarvin was the central early figure in a world of neo-reactionary writers, publishing his poetry and political theory on the blogger site under the name Mencius Moldbug. As Moldbug, Yarvin wrote about race-based IQ differences, and in an early post titled Why I Am Not a White Nationalist, he defended reading and linking to white nationalist writing. He told me he'd pursued those early writings in a spirit of open inquiry, though Yarvin also acknowledged in the post that some of his readers seemed to be white nationalists. Some of Yarvin's writing from then is so radically right-wing that it almost has to be read to be believed, like the time he critiqued the attacks by the Norwegian far-right terrorist Anders Behring Breivik, who killed 77 people, including dozens of children at a youth camp, not on the grounds that terrorism is wrong, but because the killings wouldn't do anything effective to overthrow what Yarvin called Norway's communist government. He argued that Nelson Mandela, once head of the military wing of the African National Congress, had endorsed terror tactics and political murder against opponents, and said that anyone who claimed Saint Mandela was more innocent than Breivik might have a mother you'd like to F. Okay, I'm not gonna swear on the channel, but you get the point. He's tempered himself in middle age, and he now says he has a rule never to say anything unnecessarily controversial or to go out of my way to be provocative for no reason. Many liberals who hear him talk would probably question how strictly he follows this rule. But even in his Moldbug days, most of his controversial writings were couched in thickets of irony and metaphor, a mode of speech that younger podcasters and Twitter personalities on the highly online right have adopted, a way to avoid getting kicked off tech platforms or having their words quoted by liberal journalists. Okay, we're reading Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. published in Vanity Fair, and currently on the topic of Curtis Yarvin. He considers himself a reactionary, not just a conservative. He thinks it's impossible for an Ivy League educated person to really be a conservative. He has consistently argued that conservatives waste their time and political energy on fights over issues like gay marriage or critical race theory, because liberal ideology holds sway in the important institutions of prestige media and academia, an intertwined nexus he calls the cathedral. He developed a theory to explain the fact that America has lost its so-called state capacity. His explanation for why it so often seems that it's not actually capable of governing anymore. The power of the executive branch has slowly devolved to an oligarchy of the educated, who care more about competing for status within the system than they do about America's national interest. No one directs this system, and hardly anyone who participates in it believes that it is a system at all. Someone like me, the author writes, who has made a career of writing about militias and extremist groups, might go about my work thinking that all I do is try to tell important stories and honestly describe political upheaval. But within the cathedral, the best way for me to get big assignments and win attention is to identify and attack what seem like threats against the established order, which includes nationalists, anti-government types, or people who refuse to obey the opinions of the cathedral's experts on issues like vaccine mandates in as alarming a way as I possibly can. This cycle becomes self-reinforcing and has been sent into hyperdrive by Twitter and Facebook because the stuff that compels people to click on articles or share clips of a professor tends to affirm their worldview or frighten them, or both at the same time. The more attention you gain in the cathedral system, the more you can influence opinion and government policy. Journalists and academics and thinkers of any kind now live in a desperate race for attention. And in Yarvin's view, this is all really a never-ending bid for influence, serving the interests of our oligarchical regime. So I may think I write for a living, the author says, but to Yarvin, what I actually do is more like a weird combination of intelligence gathering and propagandizing, which is why no one I was talking to at the National Conservatism Conference really thought it would be possible for me to write a fair piece about them. You won't hear people use the cathedral term a lot in public. Although right-wing Twitter lit up with delight when Yarvin sketched the concept on Tucker Carlson's Fox Nation show last September. People who have opened their eyes to this system of control have taken the red pill, a term Yarvin started using back in 2007, long before it got watered down to generally mean supporting Trump. To truly be red-pilled, you have to understand the workings of the cathedral. And the way conservatives can actually win in America, he has argued, is for a Caesar-like figure to take power back from this devolved oligarchy and replace it with a monarchical regime run like a startup. As early as 2012, Yarvin proposed the acronym RAGE, Retire All Government Employees, as a shorthand for a first step in the overthrow of the American regime. What we needed, Yarvin thought, was a national CEO, or what's called a dictator. Yarvin now shies away from the word dictator and seems to be trying to promote a friendlier face of authoritarianism as the solution to our political warfare. If you're going to have a monarchy, it has to be a monarchy of everyone, he said. By the time TechCrunch publicized Yarvin's identity in 2013, he'd become influential in a small circle of the disaffected elite. In 2014, The Baffler published a lengthy look at his influence titled Mouth-Breathing Machiavelli's Dream of a Silicon Reich. The piece warned that Yarvin's ideas were spreading among prominent figures like Thiel and Balaji, formerly the CTO of Coinbase, and that it was possible for an intellectual fringe to seize key positions of authority and power and eventually bring large numbers of people around, just as the Koch brothers once had with their pro-business libertarianism, a position that Thiel was quickly moving away from. In 2017, BuzzFeed News published an email exchange between Yarvin and Milo Yiannopoulos, in which Yarvin said that he'd watched the 2016 election returns with Thiel. He's fully enlightened, Yarvin wrote, just plays it very carefully. Masters soon had an office in Trump Tower. He and Thiel worked, generally without success, to install figures like Balaji, so I'm just going to go with the first name because I've never heard the last one pronounced, whom they proposed to head the FDA, and who himself often talked about the paper belt in an echo of Yarvin's cathedral concept and made common cause with figures like Steve Bannon. Whoops. Hold on, sorry. Here we go. Steve Bannon, who wanted to pick apart the administrative state, an idea that at least had a hint of Yarvin's rage proposal, right? Deconstruct the administrative state. Yarvin eventually stopped working as a programmer and left the Bay Area, moving with his wife and 2 children to Nevada. His wife died, rest in peace, April 2021, and he seems to have been devastated, publishing searching poems about her. But last September, a month before we spoke, he posted a dating call inviting women who were reasonably pretty and pretty smart, as he put it, and have read my work and like it, and who thought that the purpose of dating is to get married and have kids, to email him so that they could set up a Zoom date. Again, not really relevant details in this article about Peter Thiel and the New Right, but okay, fine. His writing doesn't really represent who he is, Lawrenson told me. So I answered this email and I was just like, hi, I'm a liberal, but I have a high IQ and I want kids, and I'm actually just really curious to talk to you. The two are now engaged. Lawrenson told me, the author writes, she'd had a gradual awakening that accelerated during the upheavals of the early pandemic and the protests of the summer of 2020. I started really getting drawn to neo-reactionary ideas, she said, NRX ideas, using a common online abbreviation for the neo-reactionary fringe, because I was tracking the riots, by which she meant the violence that erupted amid some of the Black Lives Matter protests. I have a background in social justice, she said, but she was horrified by how the mainstream media covered the riots. It was just such a violation of all my values. She'd had a strange realization after she and Yarvin started dating, discovering that some of her friends had been reading him for years. I found out that all these people had been reading NRX stuff just like me. They just never told anyone about it, she said. It's been very striking to me, she said, how cool this world is becoming. Yarvin had given people a way to articulate a notion that somehow felt subversive to say out loud in America, that history was headed in the wrong direction. Somebody said something earlier that captured it for me, Lawrenson said, just before they had to leave to go to a slightly hush-hush private dinner with Vance and a few others. They said, you can be here and know you're not alone. People at the conference seemed excited, and for those of you who are just joining, this is an article about the National Conservatism Conference called Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. People at the National Conservatism Conference seemed excited about being in a place where they weren't alone. I skipped most of the talks, the author writes, which ranged from sessions about confronting the threat of China to the liberal influence on pop culture to worker power. Hawley gave a keynote on the assault on the masculine virtues, and Cruz offered up a traditional stump speech evoking Reagan and saying he thought conservatives would soon prevail at the ballot box. I'm pretty sure a lot of the 20-somethings rolled their eyes at that, Yarvin said to me afterward with a smirk. The 20-somethings had a bigger vision. Up by the bar every night, hordes of young men, mostly, would descend to drink and bear hug and spot favorite podcasters and writers. You could see Dave Rubin and Jack Murphy, who hosts a popular New Rightish YouTube channel and is trying to build a fraternal group of men who believe in positive masculinity that he calls the liminal order. By the way, I did a course with Jack Murphy for the liminal order on a philosophical analysis of manliness, available at my school. Pretty much everyone had the same trimmed beard and haircut, sides buzzed short, the top longer, and combed with a bit of gel to one side. I didn't see a single black person under the age of 50, though there were attendees of South Asian and Middle Eastern descent. In March, the journalist Jeff Charlotte, a Vanity Fair contributing editor who covers the American right, tweeted that the intellectual New Right is a white supremacist project designed to cultivate non-white support. And he linked it to resurgent nationalist and authoritarian politics around the world. It's part of a global fascist movement, not limited to the anti-blackness of the US and Europe. Yet many on the New Right seem increasingly unfazed by accusations that they are white nationalists or racists. Masters in particular seems willing to goad commentators, believing that the ensuing arguments will redound to his political advantage. Good luck hitting me with that, Masters told the podcaster Alex Kashuta recently. That's the Subversive podcast. Go have a look. Arguing that accusations of racism had become a political bludgeon used to keep conservative ideas outside the political mainstream. Good luck criticizing me for saying critical race theory is anti-white. But for all the chatter of looming dystopia, no one I spoke to raised one of the most dystopian aspects of American life, our vast apparatus of prisons and policing. Most people seemed more caught up in fighting what they perceived as the cant and groupthink among other members of the political media class, or the hypocrisy of rich white liberals who put up Black Lives Matter signs in front of multi-million-dollar homes than they were with the raw experience that has given shape to America's current racial politics. Amanda Milius, was a sardonic and constant presence, easy to find smoking as Yarvin stood and talked at warp speed in his unmistakable voice. She was by far the most strikingly dressed person there, favoring Gucci and Ralph Lauren and lots of gold jewelry and big sunglasses. She's the daughter of the conservative director John Milius, who co-wrote Apocalypse Now and directed Red Dawn. She grew up in Los Angeles, and it turned out that we'd both gone to the same tiny liberal arts college in Manhattan. So, like pretty much all the people there, she was used to living in social spaces where conservative views were considered strange, if not downright evil. She thought something had radically changed since 2015, after she went to film school at USC and started working in Hollywood before she suddenly dropped everything to work for Trump's campaign in Nevada, eventually landing a job in his State Department. By the way, Jack Murphy, who was mentioned earlier, has had Amanda Milius on the Jack Murphy Live podcast, together with Darren Beatty, whom you may know, wrote a dissertation on Heidegger, so you can go see their conversation on his podcast if you'd like. What is this, she said? What this is, she said, is a new thought movement. So it's very hard to put your finger on and articulate what it is outside Trumpism, because it really is separate from the man himself. It has nothing to do with that. She argued that the new right, or whatever you wanted to call it, was paradoxically much less authoritarian than the ideology that now presented itself as mainstream. I get the feeling, and I could be wrong, she said, that the right actually at this point is like almost in this live and let live place where the left used to be at. What she meant specifically, the idea that you can't raise your kids in a traditional, somewhat religious household without having them educated at a school, that their parents are Nazis. This apparent laissez-faire obscures somewhat the intense focus that some people in this world have on trans issues, or what they might say is the media's intense focus on trans issues, one of a suite of mimetic viruses, as Kashuda, the podcaster, put it, that spread a highly individualistic liberal culture that is destructive to traditional ways of life. But the laissez-faire has helped win unlikely converts. Milius brought up Red Scare, a podcast that has become the premier example of this attraction. She'd actually cast one of the hosts, Dasha Nekrasova, in the film she made as her senior thesis in directing school at USC. Again, those of you who are here, good to be with you, reading Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets in Vanity Fair. I'm just going to keep going and then stop and head over to the chat. The Red Scare hosts both started out as diffident socialists, back when it was still possible to think that socialism represented an edgy political stance, in the little interlocking spheres of America's media and political set. One of them, Nekrasova, Dasha, I guess, actually became known in media circles for a clip that went mega viral in 2018 when she cut dead a reporter for Alex Jones's InfoWars, trying to ambush Bernie Sanders supporters at a festival in Austin. I just want people to have health care, honey, she deadpanned. You people have like worms in your brains, honestly. Okay, I don't know what that's referring to. Some of you may know. Fast forward to November 2021, and Nekrasova and her co-host Anna, again, not going to try the last name, were posting photos of themselves with Jones's arms wrapped around them under an evening Texas sun. Okay, this is the Red Scare girls and Alex Jones. Nekrasova now has a role on HBO's Succession, playing a PR rep worker with Kendall Roy. The show itself set right-wing Twitter, a sphere heavily populated by 20-somethings who work in tech or politics and seem disproportionately to live in DC and Miami, alight with delight, when an episode in the latest season included a litany of key new right phrases such as integralist and Medicare for all, abortions for none. The Red Scare hosts are only the best-known representatives of a fashionable, dissident-y subculture, centered in, but not exclusive to, downtown Manhattan. Everyone dresses like a duck hunter now, a bewildered friend of mine texted recently. People use the derisive term bugman to describe liberal men who lack tangible life skills like fixing trucks or growing food. Guys who could end up spending their lives behind the bug-eyed screen of a VR headset. Women wear clothes from Brandy Melville, which you can hear described ironically as fashion wear for girls with fascist leanings, and which named one of its lines after John Galt, the hero of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. People are converting to Catholicism. It's a good thing I have a girlfriend, my friend texted, because casual sex is out. Yarvin has mused that the liberal regime will begin to fall when the cool kids start to abandon its values and worldview. There are signs that this may be happening, though not all the so-called cool kids involved in this vibe shift would want to be colored as the vanguard in a world historical rebellion against the liberal order. I'm not like into politics, the writer Honor Levy, a Catholic convert in Bennington grad, told me when I called her. I just want to have a family someday. Levy, who was a leftist recently enough that she cried when it became clear that Bernie Sanders wouldn't be the Democratic presidential nominee, is friendly with Yarvin and has had him on the podcast she co-hosts, Wet Brain. Yeah, the cathedral and blah, blah, she said when we got to talking about political media. But she said she'd never even heard of J.D. Vance or Blake Masters. Levy is an it girl in a downtown Manhattan scene. The New Yorker has published her fiction. She's named in a New York Times story that tries to describe that scene, where right-wing politics have become an aesthetic pose that mingles strangely with an earnest search for moral grounding. Until like a year and a half ago, I didn't believe good and evil existed, she told me, later adding, but I'm not in a state of grace. I shouldn't be talking. I asked if she would take money from Thiel, and she cheerily said, of course. She also described her cohort as a bunch of libertines, and on her podcast, you can get a window into a world of people who enjoy mind-bendingly ironic thrill by tut-tutting each other for missing church or having premarital sex. Most of the girls downtown are normal, but they'll wear a Trump hat as an accessory, she said. The ones deep into the online scene, she said, want to be like Leni Riefenstahl, Eddie Sedgwick. Like Levy, Milius is in the funny position of being at the intersection of many of these crosscurrents, having worked in mainstream politics but appearing on so-called dissident podcasts, and being on the periphery of a cultural scene where right-wing politics have taken on a sheen approximating cool. She said she was too black-pilled, a very online term used to describe people who think that our world is so messed up that nothing can save it now, to think much about what it would look like for her side to win. I could effing trip over the curb, Milius said, and that's going to be considered white supremacism. Like, there's nothing you can do. What the F isn't white supremacism? They're going to come for everything, she said, and I think it's sinister. Not that I think that the people who want to pay attention to race issues are sinister, but I think that the globalization movement is using these divisive arguments in order to make people think that's a good thing. This is the cathedral at work. Okay, I think we're getting close to the end of this article. Sorry, I didn't even look how long it was before I decided we would go over it. A few weeks after NatCon, the National Conservatism Conference, I drove from California, the author writes, to Tucson to meet Masters, Blake Masters, a very tall, very thin, very fit 35-year-old. I wanted to see how all this might translate into an actual election campaign, and I'd been watching a lot of Fox News, including Yarvin's streaming interview with Carlson, in which he gave a swirling depiction of how the cathedral produced its groupthink. Why do Yale and Harvard always agree on everything, he asked. These organizations are essentially branches of the same thing, he told the mesmerized Carlson. You were like, where are the wires? He sketched his vision of, as he calls it, a constitutional regime change that would take power back from this oligarchy. So diffuse, most people hardly knew it was there. That's what makes it so hard to kill, he said. At a coffee shop near the house he'd bought when he moved back home to Tucson from the Bay Area, Masters and I went through the tenets of his nationalist platform. Onshoring industrial production, slashing legal immigration, regulating big tech companies, and eventually restructuring the economy so that one salary would be enough to raise a family on. I mentioned Yarvin and his line of arguing that America's system had become so sclerotic that it was hopeless to imagine making big systematic changes like these. In a system where state capacity is very low, I started the question. Alas, he said with a twinkle in his eye. Do we need a crisis to get there? I asked him. Maybe, he said. It wasn't where his immediate thinking was. I'll have the proverbial machete, he said. But yeah, it may take some kind of crisis to get us there. He paused. But we're already sort of in one, right? Masters often says he's not as black-pilled and pessimistic as some in the new right spheres. He seems, unlike many new writers, to still earnestly believe in the power of electoral politics. But he does think that the culturally liberal and free market ideology that has guided America's politics in recent years is a hopeless dead end. A country is not just an economy, Masters told the dissident right outlet IM 1776 recently. And just to get off the article for a minute, I would like you to know that IM 1776 has just started publishing a print version of their journal, and the first edition is out. So if you want to see what that's all about, look these guys up. Back to the article. You also need a conception of yourself as a nation, as a people, and as a culture. And that's what America is increasingly lacking today. It's true that I'm incredibly hopeful, he said to me. I think it's really bleak. I think the default is continued stagnation. And maybe you get the crisis in 5 years, or maybe it's 30 years from now. He told me that he didn't like to use terms like the cathedral and use the regime less often than Vance, although I later noticed that he used this latter phrase frequently with interviewers on the dissident right. The regime sounds really sexy, right? He said to me. It's a tangible enemy. If you could just grapple with it in the right way, you can topple it. And I think it's actually just a lot less sexy and a lot more bureaucratic, he said. But I've read that stuff and I see what it means. I asked him about the term Thiel box and how it was true that the Thiel Foundation, how true it was that the Thiel Foundation was funding a network of new right podcasters and cool kid cultural figures as a sort of cultural vanguard. It depends if it's just dissident right think tank stuff, he told me, or if anyone actually does anything. I don't know how that became a meme, he said about Thiel bucks. I think I would know if those kids were getting money. We fund some stuff, he told me, but we're not funding an army of meme posters. He told me that he and Thiel had met with Anna, one of the co-hosts of Red Scare, which was cool, he said. Their podcast is interesting. I asked if there was a world in which they might get funding from Thiel. Maybe, yeah, he said. We fund some weird stuff with the Thiel Foundation. We drove together to a campaign event talking about everything from how technology is reshaping our brains to environmental policy, both of us circling from different political directions to an apocalyptic place. I do think we're at a moment of crossroads, he said, and if we play it wrong, it's the Dark Ages. Masters has publicly said he thinks everybody should read the Unabomber's Anti-Tech Manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, which may sound strange for a young tech executive running to serve in the United States Senate. But to Masters, Kaczynski's critique was a useful analysis of how technology shapes our world and how degrading and debasing it could be to human lives. I asked whether he thought the core of his project was a fight against the consumerist techno-dystopia that many on the left have also come to fear. He said yes. I asked why, if this was the case, it almost never came across in his mainstream media appearances. That's interesting feedback, he said, that it's not coming through. I go on, and it's the tail end of the B block, and I've got 2 minutes to talk about Kyle Rittenhouse, he'd said earlier, talking about his spots on Fox News. And it's like, well, the left is insane, and this kid shouldn't have been on trial, and they're punishing him for being a white guy who defended himself with an AR-15. Conservative media seem to thrive on culture war touchpoints as much as all the rest of it. I feel like I'm willing to go there, he said, but you can't do that on Laura Ingraham soundbites. He was a little less rosy, this is on Blake Masters at the moment, about the future with some interviewers than he was with me. We need someone with their hand on the tiller who understands where we've been and where we need to go, he told the podcaster Alex Kashuda recently. Again, she's got the Subversive podcast. Otherwise, we will just get totally owned by the progressive left. And the progressive left just remains the enemy. It's the enemy of true progress. It's the enemy of everything that is good. I asked if he could give me a vision of what he thought victory for his side would look like. It's just families and meaningful work, he said, so that you can raise your kids and worship and pursue your hobbies and figure out what the meaning of it all is. Pretty much anyone can agree with this, and pretty much anyone could wonder how it is that this sort of thing has come to seem radical or distant from the lives of many people growing into adulthood today. It just feels so networked, he said. It's so in the matrix. We drove a long way into the desert before we arrived at the campaign meet and greet, which was being hosted by a former CIA official in a comfortable retirement community. The crowd of a few dozen was mostly sweater-wearing retirees, immersed in a media culture in which the people who repeated the most incendiary and Trumpist talking points tended to gain attention and political support. This kind of groupthink was not just a phenomenon of the liberal media, and this fact has hampered the campaigns of both Masters and Vance, who are often seen as Trump-aligned culture warriors, and who have had a lot of trouble working their more complicated policy ideas into our fervid political conversation. He, meaning Blake Masters, talked through his proposal to regulate tech companies as common carriers. Sorry, is that Masters? Okay, sorry about that. He talked through his proposal to regulate tech companies as common carriers, like America once regulated phone companies. The crowd seemed interested but hardly electrified. When he took questions at the end, they were mostly the usual ones about the supposedly stolen 2020 election, a view Masters did not push back on, the border wall, vaccine mandates. One man raised his hand to ask how Masters planned to drain the swamp. He gave me a sly look. Well, one of my friends has this acronym he calls RAGE, he said. Retire all government employees. The crowd liked the sound of this and erupted in a cheer. Okay, once again, just to let you know, we're reading Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets, an article in Vanity Fair. Thanks for being here. I will go over to the chat. I just figured that we'll finish the article first. On the last afternoon of NatCon, National Conservatism Conference, a few hours before he was set to give the keynote address, Vance showed up. He spotted me drinking a beer at the bar and came over to say hello. I still have no idea what I'm going to say, he said, though he didn't seem worried. I wandered down to the ballroom to wait and ended up sitting with the US correspondent for the German news magazine, Der Spiegel. I knew that some of the reporters there might have been under the impression that this was all mostly just Tweety MAGA pageantry. He had a more complex view, having just spoken to Yarvin and asked me to explain his philosophy. I found myself at a loss. I said that there were these things called the regime and the cathedral, and that Yarvin was a sort of monarchist. A monarchist, he asked? He seemed taken aback to learn what this hero figure of the New Right dreamed of was a king. Back to learn that what this hero figure of the New Right dreamed of was a king. Vance showed up wearing a suit and bright red tie, looking relaxed for a person who was about to give a speech to hundreds of people who viewed him as possibly a last great hope in saving the American nation from global corporatist subjugation. He'd shot up in the polls and at that moment was second in his primary, helped by regular invitations from Carlson. I asked how he was feeling about the speech. He looked impish. I think I've got a good topic, he said. I'm going to talk about college. What he meant was that he was about to give a genuinely thunderous speech titled, "The Universities Are the Enemy." People immediately pointed out that it was a variation on something Richard Nixon said to Henry Kissinger on the White House tapes back in 1972. Vance denounced elite colleges as enemies of the American people. He has long proposed cutting off their federal funding and seizing their endowments and redistributing them to the Millerman School. No, I'm just adding that. The speech was later linked in alarmed op-eds to anti-intellectual movements that had attacked institutions of learning. But that doesn't quite reckon with what an apocalyptic message he was offering. Because Vance and this New Right cohort, who are mostly so highly educated and well-read that their big problem often seems to be that they're just too nerdy to be an effective force in mass politics, they are not anti-intellectual. Vance is an intellectual himself, even if he's not currently playing one on TV. But he thinks that our universities are full of people who have a structural, self-serving, and financial interest in coloring American culture as racist and evil, and he's ready to go to extraordinary lengths to fight them. Yarvin and Lawrenson bounded out of the crowd as the cheers were still ringing. They were giggling, seeming to have had some wine. "Nixon, Nixon," Lawrenson said, still laughing. I couldn't tell if she was delighted or horrified. A couple of hours later, I found Vance standing up by the bar, surrounded by a circle of young and identical-looking fanboys. I went over, he asked what I thought of the speech, and suggested we find somewhere to talk. He asked me to turn my recorder off so we could speak candidly. I agreed with regret because the conversation revealed someone who I think will be hugely influential in our politics in the coming years, even if he loses his Senate primary, as both of us thought was possible. It also revealed someone who's in a dark place with a view that we're at an ominous turning point in America's history. He didn't want to describe this to me on the record, but I can show it anyway because he already says it publicly and you can hear it too. That night, I went up to my hotel room and listened to a podcast interview Vance had conducted with Jack Murphy, the big bearded head of the Liminal Order men's group. Okay, Jack Murphy Live podcast. He's done interviews with a lot of the people mentioned so far in this article. Murphy asked how it was that Vance proposed to rip out America's leadership class. Vance described two possibilities that many on the New Right imagine: that our system will either fall apart naturally, or that a great leader will assume semi-dictatorial powers. So there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things, Vance said. Murphy chortled knowingly. Yeah, Yarvin's been on his show too, by the way. So one option is to basically accept that this entire thing is going to fall in on itself, Vance went on. And so the task of conservatives right now is to preserve as much as can be preserved, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the current order. He said he thought this was pessimistic. I tend to think we should seize the institutions of the left, he said, and turn them against the left. We need like a de-Bathification program, a de-wokeification program. I think Trump is going to run again in 2024, he said. I think that what Trump should do, if I was giving him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. And when the courts stop you, he went on, stand before the country and say, he quoted Andrew Jackson giving a challenge to the entire constitutional order, the Chief Justice has made his ruling. Now let him enforce it. This is a description, essentially, of a coup, the author writes. We're in a late Republican period, Vance said later, evoking the common New Right view of America as Rome awaiting its Caesar. If we're going to push back against it, we're going to have to get pretty wild and pretty far out there and go in directions that a lot of conservatives right now are uncomfortable with. Indeed, Murphy said, among some of my circle, the phrase extra-constitutional has come up quite a bit. I'd asked Vance to tell me on the record what he'd like liberal Americans who thought that what he was proposing was a fascist takeover of America to understand. He spoke earnestly. I think the cultural world you operate in is incredibly biased, he said, against his movement and the leaders of it, like me in particular. He continued. He encouraged me to resist this tendency, which he thought was the product of a media machine, leading us towards a soulless dystopia that none of us want to live in. That impulse, he said, is fundamentally in service of something that is far worse than anything in your wildest nightmares than you see here. He gave me an imploring look as though to suggest that he was more on the side of the people, more on the side of the kind of people who read Vanity Fair than most of you realize. If what he was doing worked, he said, it will mean that my son grows up in a world where his masculinity, his support of his family and his community, his love of his community, is more important than whether it works for effing McKinsey. At that, we called it, and the crowd of young people who wanted to talk to him immediately descended on the couches. People kept bringing drinks, and there was a lot of shit talk, and it went on late. I remember thinking at one point how strange it was that in our mid-30s, Vance and I were significantly older than almost everyone there, all of whom thought they were organizing a struggle to change the course of human history, and all of whom were now going to get sloppy drunk. The next morning, wrecked, I put on sweatpants and a hoodie and tried to smuggle myself out of the hotel without having to talk to anyone. I gave my chit to the valet and looked around to find Vance and Yarvin standing there waiting for cars. How do you guys feel? Yarvin asked. Vance was wearing a hoodie too and looked like I felt. I feel horrible, he said. Not good. Yarvin asked what I'd thought of everything. I said it would take a long time for me to figure that out. We all shook hands and they waved as I got into my car and we all resumed our usual battle stations in the American info wars. Okay, well, thank you those of you who were here for that. That was a nice long article published today in Vanity Fair called Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. The author James Pogue, hope he did not mind us reading that out. Gets a larger audience that way. You had a chance to comment and hopefully you have something to discuss with one another about James Pogue's presentation of the New Right, the National Conservatism Conference. A lot of figures there you may know. Alex Kashuda, Jack Murphy, Blake Masters, J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel, Yarvin. Okay, these people are getting press now. So there you go. Well, I had some other articles queued up as well for us, like this one right here. The Enemies of Liberalism are showing us what it really means. But that was kind of long on the Vanity Fair. So let's just see here. I'm going to pop over to the chat and decide about whether or not to read this article on the Enemies of Liberalism. Now, how do I do this? Okay. Sorry I didn't have this queued up before. Let me just get this on the screen where it belongs. Whoops. Okay. Is that decent? No, not really. Well, that's better, isn't it? Okay, so Millerman Militia in the chat. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Nice to see you as usual. Do I take Ethereum for my courses? I could, yeah, I suppose. Reach out to me and we can sort it out. Not a problem. People have paid before in Bitcoin. I can see no reason why you couldn't pay in Ethereum. I'm not on the right, but I'll take the new right over the old right any day for the same reasons I'm glad Tucker Carlson has taken Bill O'Reilly's place. The dead left is against multipolarity. I think Moldbug is identifying true patterns, but without a spiritual center or vision beyond a CEO monarch. It's stuck in standard American nihilism utilitarianism. Okay, so you guys, we were reading that article in Vanity Fair. A lot of figures there, a lot of people, the National Conservatism Conference, the Dissonant Right, I Am 1776, Alex Kashuda, a bunch of people. Ezra, you're asking what article it is. I said a couple times in the video. Hopefully now it's there, and I'll drop it in the video description as well, so that everyone who wants it has access to it. But it's in Vanity Fair. Okay, well, let's see. I'm going to read this as well. Okay, I'm going to do this as well. So this is in the New York Times. It's not today. You see April 3rd, 2022. Enemies of Liberalism are showing us what it really means. I think this is a book review of a guy who wrote a book on right-wing anti-liberalism. And I just want to read it. So let's do it together. Let me get this like that. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. After 3 decades of dominance, liberalism is losing its hold on Western minds, Matthew Rose writes in his powerful new book, A World After Liberalism. By the way, the author of this op-ed is Ezra Klein. Rose does not mean liberalism in the way we typically use the word. This is not about supporting universal health care or disagreeing with Justice Samuel Alito. Rose means liberalism as in the shared assumptions of the West, a belief in human dignity, universal rights, individual flourishing, and the consent of the governed. That liberalism has been battered by financial crises, the climate crisis, checkered pandemic responses, right-wing populists, and a rising China. It seems exhausted, ground down, defined by the contradictions and broken promises that follow victory, rather than the creativity and aspiration that attend struggle. At least it did. Ukraine's refusal to bend the knee to Vladimir Putin has reminded the West that for those who have not yet learned to take it for granted, life under liberalism is worth fighting for. I sort of addressed this point in the essay that I put out yesterday on Dugin, where I mentioned that Leo Strauss had once argued the West is uncertain of its purpose and that this war has reminded the West of its purpose. You can look at that if you'd like to. But true renewal will require more than horror at Russia's invasion or peons to Ukraine's courage. It will mean grappling with liberalism's deficiencies and rediscovering its core radicalism. Yeah, so you guys know, if you followed my work at all or the work of the channel, one of the reasons we read Martin Heidegger, Leo Strauss, Carl Schmitt, Alexander Dugin, and these other figures of right-wing anti-liberalism is because we need to grapple with liberalism's deficiencies and understand what it is at its core, what it is and what it isn't. A world after liberalism is a bracing place to begin this rediscovery, in part because so much of it takes place in liberalism's era of ascendance, even as it came under violent threat. In the book, Rose profiles Oswald Spengler, Julius Evola, Francis Parker Yockey, Alain de Benoit, and Samuel Francis, 5 thinkers of the 20th century far right who are experiencing a revival in today's increasingly near right. Some of them reach into our world directly. To take one example, Evola, a not quite fascist Italian theorist, has been cited by Steve Bannon and was translated into Russian by Alexander Dugin, the philosopher and mystic, now sometimes known as Putin's Rasputin. Oh, you don't often see him described as a mystic. The argument of the anti-liberals goes something like this. Our truest identities are rooted in the land in which we're born and the kin among whom we're raised. Our lives are given order and meaning because they're embedded in the larger structure and struggle of our people. Liberalism and to some degree Christianity have poisoned our cultural soil, setting us adrift in a world that prizes pleasure and derides tradition. Multiculturalism in this telling becomes a conservative ideal. We should celebrate the strength in cultural difference, reject the hollow universalist pieties of liberals, and insist on the preservation of what sets people apart. The genius of this critique, as Rose writes, is that it recasts liberalism's virtues into vices. Quote, in theory, liberalism protects individuals from unjust authority, allowing them to pursue fulfilling lives apart from government coercion. In reality, it severs deep bonds of belonging, leaving isolated individuals exposed to and dependent on the power of the state. In theory, liberalism proposes a neutral vision of human nature, cleansed of historical residues and free of ideological distortions. In reality, it promotes a bourgeois view of life, placing a higher value on acquisition than virtue. In theory, liberalism makes politics more peaceful by focusing on the mundane rather than the metaphysical. In reality, it makes political life chaotic by splintering communities into rival factions and parties, unquote. And yet, the process runs in reverse too. Both liberalism and Christianity become thrilling when described by their critics. Far from the technocratic slog of trade regulations and the deadening work of dragging laws past the filibuster, this liberalism is a marvel of imagination and ambition. It's an ideology that believes human beings capable of new forms of social organization and a movement capable of untethering them from hierarchies so deeply embedded in our societies that they were thought to represent a natural or even divine order. Christianity too gleams with a light it often lacks in today's politics and even in its pews. Here's a religion that insists on the dignity of all people and centers the poor and the marginalized. Rose's subjects fear Christianity because they fear it cannot be tamed, even when the leaders they admire try to subvert it for their own purposes. It infects their societies with a latent egalitarianism, setting a trap that will inevitably be sprung. Part of the book's eerie relevance, again, we're reading here a review of Matthew Rose's book on anti-liberal thinkers. Part of the book's eerie relevance comes from the role Russia plays throughout. Spangler thought that the West was collapsing into incoherence, and that the next great cultural force might well emerge from a post-Bolshevik Russia. Yockey, one of the most egregious white supremacists in Rose's menagerie, wrote in anticipation of a resurgent Russia helping to correct the decadent West. By the way, just getting off the editorial here, it's also true of Heidegger and of course true of Dugin's Heideggerianism. That is certainly the role Putin has claimed for himself, in speech after speech insisting on an identity rooted in soil and culture, on an imperialism justified by power and past, and on a conception of himself and Russia as lonely bulwarks fighting for traditional European culture. When Putin gives a wartime statement standing with J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books, against cancellation by those seeking rights and recognition for transgender people, this is the serious argument lurking in the inane juxtaposition. Putin is trying to rally those yearning for the certainties of the past and offended by the constant instability of the liberal present. The logic that says Ukraine belongs to Russia, the logic that says Ukraine belongs to Russia now because it belonged to Russia then, is close cousin to the logic that defends the social hierarchies of today on the basis of their power in the past. Rowling, it should be said, wants nothing to do with Putin. You may have seen that Putin addressing J.K. Rowling. The misplaced shock that Putin would act as so many past leaders acted, that he would try to take what he wants just because he can, reflects liberalism's long work remaking not just what we believe to be moral, but what we believe to be normal. At its best and sometimes at its worst, liberalism makes the past into a truly foreign land, and that can turn those who still inhabit it into anachronisms in their own time. But liberals deceive themselves when they believe that that happens only to liberalism's enemies. It also happens to liberalism's would-be friends. You can see this clearly in Ukraine in Histories and Stories, a collection edited by Volodymyr Yermolenko. There's a particular poignancy in reading this book now, as it was released in 2019, in the interregnum between Russia's annexation of Crimea and its current invasion of Ukraine. This is the recent past, but it too feels foreign. In this collection of essays written by Ukrainian intellectuals, Ukraine is not a darling of the West. It's a country that aspires to be part of the West and struggles against the indifference and even contempt of those it admires. Throughout the book, the West's ignorance of Ukraine is a theme, with author after author recalling futile efforts to try to interest Europeans in their experience and history and possibilities. We, Ukrainians, are in love with Europe. Europe is in love with Russia, while Russia hates both us and Europe, the novelist Yuri Andrukhovich writes. The authors see Ukraine as a nation trapped painfully in a state of becoming, neither truly modern nor confidently traditionalist. Andrei Bondar, a Ukrainian essayist, offers a tragicomic list of what Ukraine lacks, including trust in institutions, the culture of comic books, the Protestant work ethic, and Calvados or any other apple spirits. But there's also much that it has, including a generally highly tolerant society, the ability to consolidate and unite efforts to attain a common goal, elements of democracy, and a talent for enduring hardship. Today, it is clear, the author continues, that these were the things that mattered. The authors also see that Ukraine is not all that it claimed to be. For us, citizens of Ukraine, Europe still looks like the Europe of the late 20th century, while it has become absolutely different today, writes Vakhtan Kebuladze, a Ukrainian philosopher. I understand this, of course, and it hurts when I see the actions of Putin's European right-wing and left-wing friends. I certainly do not like this Europe. Prophetically, Kebuladze saw that Western renewal might lie in attending to the experience of those struggling toward liberalism, not those comfortably ensconced in it. Europeans could look at themselves through the eyes of those citizens of Ukraine who came to Maidan for the sake of the European future of their country, those who are dying in the east of our country while protecting it from Russian invasion, and those who are slowly dying in Russian prisons sent there on trumped-up charges, he writes. Will you then perhaps like yourselves, or will you see a way to overcome something that you do not like? The anti-liberals' Rose profiles, in his book, all believed that liberalism prescribed a life without sacrifice, an age when individual contentment reigned supreme and collective struggle disappeared. This was not true then, and it's not true now. What they missed is what liberalism actually believes, that there is a collective identity to be found in collective betterment, that making the future more just than the past is a mission as grand as any offered by antiquity. But a critique they make thrums through our present and should be taken seriously. Liberalism needs a healthier relationship to time. Can the past become a foreign country without those who still live there being turned into foreigners in their own land? If the future is to be unmapped, then how do we persuade those who fear it or mistrust us to agree to venture into its wilds? I suspect another way of asking the same question, as Recline writes, is this. Can the constant confrontation with our failures and deficiencies produce a culture that is generous and forgiving? Can it be concerned with those who feel not just left behind, as many in America do, but left out, as so many Ukrainians were for so long? The answer to that, if there is an answer to that, may lie in the Christianity the anti-liberals feared, which too few in politics practice. What I, as an outsider to Christianity, have always found most beautiful about it is how strange it is. Here is a worldview built on a foundation of universal sin and insufficiency, an equality that bleeds out of the recognition that we're all broken, rather than that we must all be great. I've always envied the practice of confession, not least for its recognition that there will always be more to confess, and so there must always be more opportunities to be forgiven. You can see some of this spirit in secular form in the Ukrainian essays. The tone is anything but triumphalist, with Russia having taken Crimea and the rest of Europe and the United States shrugging it off. The perspective is largely tragic, clear-eyed about the work that may go undone and the distance left to travel. But the writing is generous too, suffused with love for country, honesty about an often bloody history, determination despite a disappointing present, and above all, a commitment to one another. There's much to learn from in that merger of self-criticism and deep solidarity. So this was an article called The Enemies of Liberalism Are Showing Us What It Really Means, published April 3rd in the New York Times, written by Ezra Klein, and drawing on these two books, Ukraine in History and Stories, a collection edited by Volodymyr Yermolenko, and the book by Matthew Rose, titled, where's the title of the book? I have it, so I should know, but yeah, here it is. A World After Liberalism. Okay, that's what that was. Good to be with everybody. Nice to see you, everybody who's here. Appreciate your time. Hope you're finding these articles interesting. I will post the links in the video at some point, or in the comments or somewhere, so you can go have a look if you'd like to. Follow them up. Take a look at Matthew Rose's book, all the people who are mentioned in this article, Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. And I think that even though I had these other articles I wanted to look at, we'll probably stop here because I'm tired. It's been a long stream. So let me pop into the chat. The right's disregard of current and especially historical struggles of people is one major reason why I'm not a right winger in America, writes Mohammed. I stand with J.K. Rowling. You see here. This is a very specific description of a very broad umbrella of anti-liberalism, Kevin writes about that book. Yeah, so you can have I haven't read Matthew Rose's book yet. As I say, I have a copy. I haven't read it. The figures that I work on are a little bit different. Leo Strauss, Martin Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, Alexander Dugin, as you know, including figures you may be less familiar with, like Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, for example. I have a course on him in my school. What else do we have here? Okay, well, in any event, thanks for being here. Appreciate your time, and see you in the next stream. Take it easy. If there's anything here that you wanted to comment on, definitely do comment on it in the comment section. Like, subscribe, share, visit millermanschool.com if you'd like to. And until next time, take care, be well, goodbye.